My parents always favored my younger sister, and I spent my entire life living in her shadow. Then, one fateful Thanksgiving, she discovered that I had accumulated $10 million and had a complete meltdown in front of the entire family. Whenever people ask about my childhood, I usually change the subject. It wasn't that I lacked food or shelter, but my upbringing was far from ideal. My name is Evelyn, and I'm 38 years old. I've decided to share my story, not for sympathy, but because I know someone out there might relate. Everything changed when I was 8 years old. My sister, Lillian, was born prematurely, and my parents' entire world suddenly revolved around her. I still remember that night vividly, my father rushing to the hospital while my Aunt Melissa stayed behind with me. Everyone was on edge about the baby, and I was no different. I didn't fully understand the dangers of premature births, but I knew something was wrong. Lillian survived, but she was fragile. Our home became an extension of the hospital, filled with the constant hum of medical equipment, the scent of disinfectants clinging to the air. My mother was obsessed with keeping everything clean, constantly wiping surfaces and monitoring Lillian's health like a hawk. If I so much as sniffled, my mother's concern was never for me, it was always for my sister. "Evelyn, was that a cough?" she'd ask, her voice sharp with alarm. "We can't take any chances. Pack a bag, you're staying at Grandma's for a few days." At first, those visits to my grandmother's house felt like little adventures. But as time passed, I realized I wasn't being sent away for my own good, I was being removed, discarded like an inconvenience. It became clear that I was always second in my parents' eyes. No matter what I did, Lillian always came first. A childhood of neglect. Desperate to earn my parents' attention, I threw myself into school. I excelled in every subject, took part in extracurricular activities, and even won science fairs. But no matter how hard I tried, my accomplishments were met with indifference. "Look, Mom, I won first place," I'd say, beaming as I held up my trophy. "That's nice, dear," she'd reply absent-mindedly. "Did you wash your hands?" Lillian's been feeling a little under the weather. By the time Lillian turned 7, her health had improved. She was no longer the fragile child she once was, but my parents never outgrew their overprotective tendencies. They continued treating her like she was made of glass, shielding her from every hardship, and Lillian took full advantage of it. She learned quickly that she could manipulate our parents by playing the victim. If she wanted something, all she had to do was shed a few tears or fake an illness. It worked every time. High school was supposed to be my chance to shine, my opportunity to finally be seen. I worked harder than ever, keeping my grades high, joining clubs, and dedicating myself to my future. But it never mattered. One night, my science teacher pulled my parents aside after a school event. "Evelyn has a real shot at earning a scholarship," he told them. "She's one of the brightest students I've ever taught." But before he could finish, my mother's phone rang. Lillian, who had been left at home with the babysitter, was crying. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" my mother asked in a panic. "I can't find my favorite pen," Lillian wailed through the receiver. "The one Evelyn gave me is awful." That was it. My parents immediately ended the conversation, rushing home to help Lillian find a pen. From that moment on, they stopped attending my school events altogether. "It's just easier this way," they reasoned. "Lillian gets upset when she feels left out." When I won the state debate championship, my parents didn't even acknowledge my victory. I found my trophy tucked away in a drawer. "Lillian doesn't like seeing other people's awards," my mother explained dismissively. College and independence. I was determined to escape. College was my ticket out, and I worked relentlessly to secure a full-ride scholarship. I was overjoyed when I was accepted into my dream school, my tuition and living expenses completely covered, but my family's reaction? Indifference. At dinner, Lillian barely looked up from her phone before rolling her eyes. "Finally, you're moving out," she scoffed. "I'm turning your room into my gaming setup. I want 3 monitors and a streaming rig." That was the moment I truly realized I didn't belong in that house. I started counting down the days until I could leave. During my college years, I minimized my visits home, only returning for the occasional holiday dinner. Even then, it was always the same, Lillian monopolizing every conversation while my parents showered her with attention. After graduating at 23, I landed a managerial position at a mid-sized company, Harper & Company. The salary wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to afford my own place, and that was all I needed then. One day, I stumbled across something that would change my life forever. While scrolling through social media, an ad caught my eye. Learn how to make your money work for you. Normally, I ignored those kinds of things. But something about it intrigued me. Maybe it was the promise of financial freedom. Maybe it was the desire to prove, once and for all, that I was capable of achieving something on my own. The course wasn't free, but I could afford it if I cut back on expenses. So, I took the plunge. That decision altered my future in ways I never could have imagined. The path to wealthy instructor, Daniel, made investing seem simple. He broke down the concepts of stock trading, portfolio management, and financial risk in a way that was easy to grasp. I was hooked. I started small, investing a few $100s in tech stocks. I researched the market obsessively, learning about trends and risk management. My first major win came when I invested in a little-known AI startup. I had put in $400, and within 3 months, my investment had tripled. From there, I expanded. A biotech company skyrocketed my portfolio even further. Soon, my earnings from investments surpassed my actual salary. I'll never forget the moment I realized I could quit my job. Sitting at my desk, pretending to care about meaningless paperwork, I checked my portfolio. A stock I had invested in had just hit a record high. Running the numbers, I realized my passive income had tripled my monthly salary. That same day, I drafted my resignation letter. I had finally done it, but despite my financial independence, I still attended family dinners, clinging to some foolish hope that things would change. Every time, I sat quietly while my parents discussed Lillian's life as if she were the center of the universe. "Evelyn, you're still working at Harper & Company, right?" my mother would ask in passing, barely interested in my response. "Yeah," I'd reply vaguely, knowing they'd stop listening before I even finished. They never once asked about my career, my aspirations, or my happiness. It was easier to let them believe I was still just a simple office worker than to explain the reality that I was wealthier than they could ever imagine. But everything changed the night Lillian found out the truth. Despite my newfound financial freedom, I maintained the facade of an ordinary life. I attended family dinners, listened to my parents boast about Lillian's achievements, and played the role of the unremarkable older sister. It was easier that way. No questions, no expectations. Lillian was accepted into Westwood University, an elite private school with astronomical tuition fees. My parents were ecstatic. "She deserves the best," they'd say proudly. "We took out loans, but it's worth it for her future." During one dinner, Lillian casually mentioned, "My roommate has a designer backpack. Everyone at Westwood comes from wealthy families." Her voice dripped with envy. It was a subtle reminder to my parents that she felt out of place, and they immediately took the bait. My mother sighed dramatically, "We're doing everything we can, sweetheart. Just focus on your studies." I watched as my parents fawned over her, completely oblivious to how manipulative she was. Lillian had mastered the art of playing the victim. One evening, I arrived at my parents' house and found my mother crying over a stack of bills. My father sat nearby, rubbing his temples in frustration. "Property taxes went up again," he muttered, "and with Lillian's tuition." His voice trailed off. I stood there, watching them struggle. Despite everything, the favoritism, the neglect, I couldn't ignore their financial pain. They were still my parents. That night, I set up an automatic transfer of $5,000 a month to their account. I didn't tell them about my investments or how much I was truly worth. I just wanted to help, quietly and without recognition. The next day, my mother called, her voice trembling with emotion. "Evelyn, this helps more than you know. I don't even have the words to thank you." It was the first time in years she had shown me any genuine appreciation. For a brief moment, I let myself believe that things were changing, that maybe my parents were finally seeing me for who I was. But that hope was shattered when I overheard them in the kitchen one evening. "We should give some of Evelyn's money to Lillian," my mother suggested. "She feels so out of place surrounded by all those rich kids. At least $300 a month should help her fit in." My father agreed without hesitation. "Good idea. She deserves to have nice things like her classmates." I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to them discuss how to funnel my money into Lillian's social life. My stomach twisted with anger and betrayal. They didn't see me as their daughter, they saw me as a bank account. I wanted to confront them, to shout that I had earned every penny through my own hard work and investments. But I stayed silent, too hurt to speak. I quietly left the house, my heart heavy with the realization that I would never be more than second place to them. A new chapter. By the time I turned 30, my investments had exceeded my wildest expectations. I was earning more in a month than most people did in a year. I decided it was time to stop renting and finally purchase a place of my own. After months of searching, I found the perfect apartment. It was secure, spacious, and had a stunning view of the city skyline. Most importantly, I could buy it outright, no mortgage, no debts, no financial ties to anyone. The day I received the keys, I stood in the empty living room, my footsteps echoing against the walls. This was mine. For the first time in my life, I had something that no one could take away from me. Shortly after I moved in, my mother called, pretending to check in on me but inevitably steering the conversation to Lillian. "How's your new place?" she asked absently. "It's nice," I replied, keeping my answer vague. I knew she didn't really care about the details. "That's good. Don't spend too much on rent, honey. You never know when you might lose your job." I nearly laughed. If only she knew that I hadn't worked a traditional job in years. My investments were my career now, and they were more stable than any office position could ever be. At the next family gathering, Aunt Melissa asked about my new apartment. Before I could respond, my mother jumped in. "Evelyn's renting a new place," she said dismissively, barely giving me a glance. "But wait until you hear about Lillian's news. She's about to graduate at the top of her class." As always, the spotlight was on Lillian. I quietly sipped my drink as my relatives fawned over her, occasionally giving me sympathetic glances as if I were some tragic background character. "She's going places," my father declared proudly. "Not that we're surprised, she's always been our shining star." I watched as Lillian basked in their praise, her ego inflating with every compliment. Meanwhile, no one bothered to ask about my life, my career, or my happiness. Then came Lillian's graduation party. My parents went all out, catered food, elegant decorations, even a live band. It was painfully obvious that a significant portion of my monthly contributions had been spent on the celebration. Lillian strutted around in her cap and gown as if she were royalty. She spotted me standing by the drinks table and immediately made her way over, holding her diploma like a weapon. "Look at this, Evelyn," she said smugly, shoving it in my face. "Westwood University, not some state school like yours. And I already have interviews lined up with top companies. I'm not going to end up in a dead-end job like you." I took a slow sip of my drink, refusing to take the bait. "Congratulations, Lillian," I said calmly. "That's all you have to say?" she sneered. "Aren't you jealous? I'm about to be so much more successful than you." She stood there, waiting for me to admit defeat, to acknowledge her superiority. I could have easily told her the truth, that I was wealthier than she could ever dream of, that my investments earned more in a day than she would in her entire first year of work, but I didn't. There was no point. She wouldn't believe me even if I did. So, I simply shrugged and walked away, leaving her standing there with her diploma clutched in her hand like a trophy. 3 months later, Lillian was still unemployed. Those prestigious companies she had bragged about weren't as eager to hire her as she had claimed. Meanwhile, the student loan bills had started arriving, and she was drowning in debt. One evening, my mother called, her voice filled with concern. "Evelyn, we hate to ask, but Lillian's loan payments are really taking a toll on us. Is there any way you could increase your monthly contribution?" I took a deep breath, my mind swirling with memories of every time they had overlooked me, dismissed my accomplishments, and favored Lillian. But I also thought about my bank account, which was sitting comfortably in the 8-figure range. "How much do you need?" I finally asked. My mother hesitated on the phone, as if trying to make the number sound less outrageous. "If you could increase it to $3,500 a month, it would really help us cover Lillian's student loans and other expenses." I closed my eyes, the familiar pang of resentment tightening in my chest. I thought about all the years I had spent striving for their approval, all the accomplishments they had brushed aside. But my bank account was overflowing, and they were still my parents. "All right," I agreed, keeping my voice neutral. "I'll adjust the payments starting next month." My mother's relief was palpable. "Oh, Evelyn, you have no idea how much this means to us. Lillian will be so grateful. I highly doubted that. But I didn't say anything. There was no point. A few weeks later, Lillian finally landed a job at the company where my father conveniently had connections. He knew the HR manager from college, and just like that, Lillian was hired with the title of manager. She boasted about it endlessly, conveniently omitting the fact that she hadn't earned the position through merit. One weekend, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off some paperwork. Lillian was sprawled across the couch, scrolling through her phone. "Everything is ridiculously overpriced," she complained. "I can't believe I have to live here with mom and dad. It's so humiliating." I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to remind her that she was living rent-free. "You could look for a smaller apartment or find a roommate," I suggested. She shot me a withering glare. "I need to live in the right neighborhood. Not that you'd understand. Some of us have standards." Her condescending tone was nothing new, but it still stung. I glanced around at our parents' modest living room, feeling the familiar ache of being dismissed once again. But I stayed silent, refusing to let her see how much her words hurt the Thanksgiving reveal. Thanksgiving was approaching, and my mother insisted on hosting the annual family dinner. I could hear the stress in her voice as she called me, lamenting about the mountain of preparations. "I pulled my back lifting Lillian's laundry," she complained. "I don't know how I'm going to cook for everyone." I saw an opportunity to help, something I did far too often. "Why don't I handle the food this year? I'll have it catered from that new restaurant downtown." My mother's mood instantly brightened. "Oh, Evelyn, you're such a lifesaver. I don't know what we'd do without you." In the background, I heard Lillian scoff. Even the smallest acknowledgement of my efforts was enough to sour her mood. Thanksgiving arrived, and the catered food was delivered right on time. I set everything up, arranging the dishes neatly while Lillian criticized the store-bought stuffing and complained about the lack of homemade pies. I bit my tongue, letting her words roll off me. I had brought my laptop along because the Asian stock markets were opening during dinner, and I wanted to monitor my investments. I set up my computer in my old bedroom, letting the live trading software run in the background. Dinner started off relatively normal. The food was a hit, and everyone complimented my choice of caterer. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel a sense of pride. Then, my mother spoke up. "I was so worried about how I'd manage all this cooking," she told the room, "but Evelyn saved the day. She arranged all this catering." "Wasn't that thoughtful?" Aunt Melissa smiled at me. "That was really generous of you, Evelyn. It must have cost a fortune." I shrugged, brushing off the praise. "I just wanted everyone to enjoy dinner." My mother continued, her tone oddly affectionate. "Evelyn's been helping us a lot lately. Her job pays well enough to support us and Lillian's student loans." That was the first time I'd ever heard her acknowledge anything I did. Across the table, I saw Lillian's face twist into a scowl. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. Without warning, she shoved her chair back and stormed out of the dining room. I assumed she was throwing one of her usual tantrums, but something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a sense of impending chaos. A few minutes later, she reappeared, gripping my laptop in her hands. Her face was a mask of malicious satisfaction. "Let's see how generous Evelyn really is," she announced, her voice dripping with contempt. "If she's so rich, she won't mind us knowing just how much money she's hiding." My stomach dropped. "Lillian, don't," but it was too late. She had already turned the laptop around, revealing my investment account on the screen. I had forgotten to close the trading app. The numbers were clearly displayed, $10, $237, $462. The room went silent. I could hear the clock ticking, the hum of the refrigerator, even the shallow breaths of my relatives as they stared at the screen in shock. Lillian's face went pale, her hands trembling as she processed the number. $10 million, she whispered, her voice cracking. My mother's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with disbelief. There must be some mistake. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. There's no mistake. That's my account. I've been investing for years. My father's face twisted with anger. You've had all this money, and you let us struggle to pay Lillian's tuition? I was speechless. I send you $3,500 every month. How is that letting you struggle? My mother's face turned red. Your sister has student loans. She deserves to have a good life, to fit in with her classmates. How could you be so selfish? I felt my composure crack. Years of resentment surged to the surface, a tidal wave of emotions that I could no longer contain. Selfish? You're calling me selfish? I spat. Where was all this concern when I needed help? When I was working my way through college on a scholarship because you spent all your money on Lillian's private school? My mother opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. You always put her first. Always. And I was never enough for you. But here's the truth, I earned every penny in that account. I studied the markets, made smart investments, and built my wealth from nothing. My father's jaw tightened. We're your parents. We sacrificed everything for you. You owe us. I felt a cold, bitter laugh escape my lips. No. I don't owe you anything. Not after a lifetime of being second best. The room was silent, everyone staring at me as if I were a stranger. Even Lillian looked stunned, her facade crumbling as she realized I was no longer under her thumb. I grabbed my laptop from her shaking hands. I'm done. You used me long enough? I walked out of the house without another word, leaving behind the family that never truly saw me. As I reached my car, I could still hear them shouting, their voices echoing through the cold night air. I knew then that nothing would ever be the same. The drive home was a blur. My phone buzzed non-stop, calls, texts, voicemails, all from my parents and Lillian. I ignored every single one, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I fought to control my emotions. By the time I reached my apartment, the shock had worn off, replaced by a searing anger. How could they twist this around and make me the villain? After everything I had done for them, all the sacrifices I had made, they still saw me as nothing more than a financial safety net. I tossed my keys on the counter, slumped onto my couch, and let the tears fall. Not from sadness, but from years of suppressed pain and resentment. I had always known I was the afterthought, the backup plan, the convenient option. But seeing it laid out so blatantly in front of my entire family was a different kind of betrayal. After an hour of crying and collecting myself, I opened my phone to check the damage. Dozens of missed calls, countless texts. They ranged from angry accusations to desperate pleas, each one designed to manipulate and guilt-trip me. Lillian's messages were the worst. She blamed me for everything, her student loans, her job struggles, her inability to fit in with her wealthy peers. She called me selfish, heartless, and accused me of ruining her life by hiding my success. I scrolled through the messages with numb detachment, realizing that nothing I said would ever change their perspective. They would never see me as a person with feelings and ambitions of my own. To them, I was nothing more than an ATM. Then, I saw the social media posts. My mother had taken to Facebook, spinning the story to make herself the victim. She wrote about how her cold-hearted daughter had been hiding her wealth while her family struggled, how she refused to help her poor sister, and how money had corrupted me. She ended the post with a plea for prayers, asking people to pray that I'd remember the true meaning of family. The comments were brutal. Friends, distant relatives, even people I didn't recognize all chimed in, condemning me without knowing the full story. Words like ungrateful, cruel, and selfish filled the comments section. My vision blurred with anger. They had no idea what my childhood had been like, how hard I had worked, how much I had sacrificed just to be noticed. And yet, I was the villain in their narrative. I took a deep, steadying breath, my fingers trembling as I opened my banking app. I stared at the automatic transfers to my parents, $3,500 every month, money they had taken for granted as if it were their right. With one tap, I canceled the payments. Then, I typed out a final message to my mother. I've stopped the payments. I'm done being your personal bank. Don't contact me again. I blocked their numbers, deleted their contacts, and wiped my social media accounts clean. I didn't want them finding another way to manipulate me. The next morning, I called the property manager of my building. Hi, James. I need to add some names to the do not allow in list. He took down their names, descriptions, and promised to alert security. I wasn't surprised when he called me that afternoon to report that my parents and Lillian had shown up, demanding to see me. They had made a scene, yelling in the lobby, insisting that I owed them my attention, my money, my life. I thanked James and hung up, feeling a strange sense of relief. A new beginning. I spent the next few days in isolation, reflecting on everything that had happened. I had cut off my own family, walked away from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But the truth was, they never did. They loved what I could give them, not who I was. For years, I had allowed them to define my worth, to dictate my place in their hierarchy. But now, I was free. I opened my laptop and began browsing real estate listings. It was time for a fresh start, somewhere far away where they couldn't reach me. I looked at cities across the country, places where I could build a life that was mine and mine alone. I chose a small coastal town, a place with ocean views and quiet streets where no one knew my name. I made an offer on a beautiful house overlooking the water, paying in full. No loans, no debts, no connections to anyone but myself. On my last day in the city, I stood in my empty apartment, looking at the blank walls and packed boxes. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't say goodbye. As I drove away, the sun was setting over the skyline, casting everything in shades of gold and pink. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I was free from their expectations, free from their manipulation, free from the role they had forced me to play, and for the first time in my life, I was truly happy. Sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is walk away, even if it means leaving behind the people who were supposed to love you the most. I chose myself. And I have no regrets.